and welcome to the 5th session in American English Live Series 16. We are so excited that each of you are here with us today. My name is Kara, and I'll be with you today along with my colleague behind the scenes, Elena, who will be moderating and helping answer your questions and responding to your comments. I'm going to let our bumper video play. Wonderful. Let's begin today with those wonderful audience comments from our most recent webinar, The Line Between Questions, Responses, and Critical Reading with Spencer Salas. Saira in Pakistan shared, I was planning to improve my students' reading skills, and this session on QAR framework made it easier to get my desired goal. Looking forward to using such highly informative and easy to use methods. Mihaela in Romania shared, it was a fabulous presentation with extremely interesting strategies for reading that help students to gain self-confidence and increase their desire for more English. Thank you. Thanks for that great comment. And Regina from Mexico said, I absolutely loved the session. I appreciate the QAR not only challenges students' reading skills, but also promotes comprehension achievement, and I cannot wait to use it in my classroom. Thank you. Well, thank you, Regina. We're excited that you are using that content in your classroom. We love to see our teacher participants actively engaged in professional development, so please continue to share your thoughts about our webinars by offering feedback through the end of session quiz form or by emailing them to americanenglishwebinars@fhi360.org. We may feature one of your comments during the next session. Throughout Series 16, we are exploring the themes of teaching about climate change in the EFL classroom and approaches for teaching a variety of core ELT topics. We hope you are able to use the practical ideas we share in your classrooms. So here's what to expect today. The session is about 60 minutes long. The presenter will present the material, and I, as your host, will ask questions and make comments too. But really, we hope to hear from you, our audience, so that we can address your ideas and experiences. So throughout the session, please share your thoughts using the comments feature or chat box. When our session comes to a close, you will have an opportunity to receive a digital badge for your participation. At the end of the webinar, we'll share a link in the comments. Click on that link and complete a short quiz about today's session. You must answer 2 out of 3 multiple choice questions correctly. Once you have successfully passed the quiz, you can expect to get your badge via email within about a week. And before we begin, we want to encourage you to check out the latest English Teaching Forum, Volume 61, Number 1, to discover strategies for making learning inclusive in digital environments, learning about a mindful gratitude exercise, find ways to use fun facts to engage your students, and much more. Visit the link being shared by our moderator now to view this edition of English Teaching Forum. Now for today's webinar, Target Language Use in the Classroom, Teaching Speaking Differently. English as a foreign language classes often rely on textbook language in teaching speaking, which might limit students' scope and leave aside essential communicative strategies. This webinar will focus on the use of real-world, authentic communication strategies in the target language for teaching speaking. The emphasis is on the use of various discourse strategies that help establish a language-rich environment and facilitate the authentic use of the target language in the EFL classroom. Participants will be introduced to strategies for effectively incorporating authentic target language in their lessons, in classroom routines, in language practice, as well as an assessment of speaking gains. And we are pleased to introduce our presenter, Jane Borisova. Jane has always loved traveling and learning languages. Born and raised in a family of pedagogues, she received a classical education in a variety of disciplines, providing a solid foundation for her pursuit of a career in international education and language teaching. Jane is fluent in Russian, French, and English. Her appreciation for applied linguistics has not been confined to learning about the intricacies of the English language. However, Jane has always wanted to share her passion and experience in second language acquisition with others. She obtained a master's degree in linguistically diverse education at the University of Northern Colorado and continued teaching international and domestic students while collaborating with faculty from all over the world. She leads a team of dedicated professionals in the intensive English program at the University of Northern Colorado and teaches linguistics to students who seek endorsement in her field. Welcome, Jane.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening to some of you. Thank you so much, Kara, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone, once again to American English Live Teacher Development Series 16. I'm very excited for all of you to join me today for this professional development presentation on how to approach teaching speaking skills through promoting the use of authentic target language in your classroom. As a language learner myself and English as a second and a foreign language teacher, I bear witness to how challenging it is to actually teaching and practicing speaking skills for both teachers and students. It's a difficult area to acquire because, think about it, it encompasses all essential skills. To be able to express yourself in English or in the target languages we're referring to, one must have sufficient vocabulary, internalized grammatical rules, master pronunciation, and intonation. And of course, we have to be able to use proper strategies to communicate ideas clearly and in a matter of seconds. All of this has to come together. So today we are going to talk about how to incorporate target language in lessons with specific focus on discourse strategies that help add authenticity, real life feel to the target language, in this case, English. Okay, so before we jump into all of the nuances, I'm going to go over the outline of today's webinar. And the first thing we're going to address is the reasons for more target language use in the classroom. Then we'll talk about some general ways of incorporating target language in our lessons. We'll review some authentic target language use with specific focus on discourse strategies. And we'll look at some fun activities for target language and discourse strategy practice in your classroom. All right. Before we move on, I wanted to note one little thing. Target language. I'm going to be referring to this term throughout the presentation. What it means is authentic, real life English. Okay. All right. So let's talk briefly about reasons why it's necessary to increase exposure to target language in the classroom to help our students gain advanced speaking skills, right? And everything starts with focusing on too much textbook, right? We've all been there. I've been there, I've seen it, right? So there is a lot of bonuses and limitations in focusing on just the textbook, right? That leads sometimes to insufficient practice of real world language. And we also know that when we travel, we can sometimes feel how that clashes our textbook knowledge with the real world scenarios and real world language use. EFL classrooms might be the only exposure for your students to the target language, right? So 40, 30 minutes a day, maybe 3 times a week is all they have to be able to practice their speaking skills in some instances. Then we also know that acquisition or really getting the language, your second language, your third language, any foreign language, right, is possible via exposure to large quantities of target language. And that's according to Stephen Krushen, one of the leaders in the field of second language acquisition. We also know that acquisition happens by figuring out meaning while communicating with others. So this aspect I will be returning to throughout the presentation. And of course, exposure to larger volumes of comprehensible input or understandable messages, right? In being able to engage with the language creates meaning making, and comprehension leads to retention of information in the target language, or how much are students able to remember, right? An ability to manipulate or use the newly learned, newly acquired language to create their own expression. Next slide, please. Now it's reflection time. So how do you incorporate target language in your classes to teach speaking? Please share some of your ideas in the chat.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane, for that great introduction to today's content. So let us know, audience, here in the chat, how do you incorporate target language in your classes to teach speaking? We're really excited to hear your responses. I'm seeing Rashad's comments saying, don't be afraid to make mistakes. Absolutely. We'll be talking about that quite a bit later in today's session. I'm seeing Irina saying regular greetings, role plays, and peer checks. Asra is saying ask learners to discuss in a group in the target language. Wonderful. We've got a few more comments here. Angela is saying videos and short documentaries, discussions around those listening activities. Andrea is saying my classes always start about asking about their past week, so they have to practice speaking. And it sounds like they're coming up with that dialogue all on their own, not provided for them.
That is fantastic.
Jesus is saying real life situations and discussions. So it sounds like we're getting lots of these real life speaking practice ideas, Jane.
That is phenomenal. And that's exactly what we're going to focus on today. We're on the right track. Okay. All right. So now that we've shared ideas, and a lot of your ideas are phenomenal, and that's actually what we do in our program as well, let's talk a little bit about incorporating target language in the classroom. So before we do anything, right, the first thing that we have to ensure is establishing a language-rich environment in our classroom. What that means is that whatever the teacher says and uses has to be part of that language-rich environment. Texts and videos that you have mentioned, what students access or produce also has to reflect the real life language use. Authentic realia in the classroom can also add this flair of having a language-rich classroom. Authentic realia can be anything from songs, like those lyrics that we've mentioned, maybe even news articles, right? Hot topics on Twitter, any social media things that are being discussed in the authentic language that you can mirror, right? You can actually use in your classroom as well. And the second area that I would like to emphasize here, the second large domain of incorporating target language in the classroom, has to do with monitoring and supporting student comprehension. And I've already seen phenomenal comments from some of you saying that creating a safe environment and letting students make mistakes is the first essential step in promoting speaking skills. And we know that we would like to be correct, and we want to help our students, and we would like to correct them all the time, but creating a safe environment for your students to make mistakes is where acquisition, is where learning happens, right? So that's very important to pull back sometimes. Using gestures. Sometimes even that can be a very important comprehensible input mechanism, that understandable thing that your students can relate to and follow you. Modeling is yet another way to support your student comprehension. Whatever it is that you really want your students to acquire and accomplish has to be modeled by you. Right? Has to be modeled. Using visuals is definitely one of the most important mechanisms of creating comprehension. And in that comprehension, learning happens, right? Building contextual background or making your students talk about their past week, right? About their experiences, about their journeys, about their understanding of the topic is essential as well to promote the target language use in the classroom. Okay. Wonderful. All right, before we move along with the presentation, I've mentioned safe classroom environment multiple times already. Just wanted to bring your attention one more time to the idea that it means let your students be, let them experiment with the language, let them explore their own expression without constantly correcting. And you are welcome to use indirect error correction techniques that you can definitely find in multiple sources on the web. Thank you. All right, so another important aspect I wanted to focus on is differentiating the target language use in classrooms with beginners, right, versus the ones that are more advanced. So for beginners, of course, remember that the most important thing here is to make your students understand and start participating. Maybe slower than you would like at the very beginning, but it's still participation, and that's what gets them where they need to be, right? So they can raise one or two fingers, right? Yes, no, to show you comprehension. They can arrange visuals on the board to be able to show you that they understand what's going on. They can select the best summary prompt, for example, from multiple prompts that you might have available to them to show comprehension. So that's all that gradual beginning, letting them participate maybe kinesthetically with their body first and then orally. So when we elicit gradually more difficult production in oral speech, right? When we want to increase fluency and accuracy, we start with W questions instead of yes or no questions. We use more complex prompts, and we also model more complex descriptions and discussions. And the word impromptu is going to also come up several times throughout this presentation. That means spontaneous, right? So we want our students to spontaneously respond, spontaneously have the things maybe not always correctly. Again, remember, we have to let go at some point and just enjoy the experimentation. And modeling authentic interaction. Can't overemphasize this. Modeling is extremely important. Whatever we say, whatever strategies we use, whatever phrases we use are going to be the driving force behind your students' practice. All right, so let's take a look now at some of the discourse strategies, right? So we are talking about encouraging this authentic communication and interaction in the target language through discourse strategies and scenario-based interaction. Okay. Right, some key definitions here. Once again, discourse, I've already referred to this word multiple times, right? What does that mean? It means communicating your thoughts and ideas orally, right? Now, discourse strategies have to do with different language tools such as vocabulary, phrases, intonation that are used to make communication clear, authentic, and effective. Now, scenario-based teaching, I can tell that most of you are familiar with this, is using real-life situations, such as, being at a cafe, calling on the phone, or having a classroom debate as some of your core practical activities in teaching speaking. Okay. Fantastic. All right, so discourse strategies, what are those things? We've mentioned they're tools, right? They're language tools, but what do we use them for? Well, we use them to express ourselves clearly within the cultural and contextual norms. These two phrases, right, are going to be extremely important, cultural and contextual norms. We use discourse strategies to demonstrate English communication skills in low-stake and high-stake environment. Low stake, talking to your friends, right? And high stake, maybe you're responding to questions in front of the class. To sound more culturally aware when using the target language, or in this case, English, is also why we use discourse strategies, okay? All right, so reflection time. What are some examples of discourse strategies that you can think of? Please do share it in the chat.
Thank you, Jane. Absolutely. Let us know in the chat, what are some examples of discourse strategies? And while you do that, I just want to say, Jane, that a lot of our participants were really resonating with what you were saying about a safe environment being incredibly valuable to teaching speaking. We had some participants, Sidra, saying a safe environment is necessary to have students practice. Adnan is saying a safe environment helps our students to build confidence. And Fernando said, students need to be aware that making mistakes is part of the process. The more they participate and the more mistakes they make, the better, because those mistakes are a valuable source of data for teachers. And then the teacher can use that data for several types of activities and build that error correction into their lesson planning.
Oh,
so
indeed.
Were great responses to your point about the importance of having a safe environment.
Absolutely.
So back to our current question, now that we know what discourse strategies are, what are some examples of discourse strategies? We've got Mehwish saying dialogues writing.
Mm-hmm.
We have Aiton saying to use action-oriented approaches with scenarios. We have for Pasara saying poem, and Azram is following up with that same idea of haiku, using some of those more creative writing and speaking aspects. Irina is saying reading comics and creating them, talking about the storyline of a comic strip, that storytelling components. Wonderful. And our last comment here that I'll read out, there are so many coming in, is Pinky saying debate, which I know
we'll
is
talk
coming.
about that.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah, these are amazing comments, and it's great to see that we're all on the same page. By the way, one of the discourse strategies right here. All right, so let's dive into what these discourse strategies are. The core ones, of course. Please refer to the Discourse Strategies document shared in the pre-webinar resources for more information about other discourse strategies. But the first thing we have to address is why discourse strategies, and of course, why questions and opinions is selected as one of the core strategies used in the target language. Well, sharing opinions, right, and asking for opinions helps us maintain a conversation flow. Otherwise, it's going to be a monologue, right? It's me talking to you and no reciprocation, right? It demonstrates engagement, and this strategy also helps build fluency, because when you're using the language that is not your native, that is not your first language, right? You might be also using it impromptu and creating expression as you go, right? So these strategies are incredibly important, okay? Let's take a look at how they look, right? What these questions and opinions look like. All right, expressing opinions. What can be more essential than this, right? And we are probably all familiar with words like, well, I think, in my opinion. These are very common and great, but there is such a great variety of these different phrases and sentence starters that can indicate someone is expressing an opinion without actually saying the words, it's my opinion. So if you say you know and start explaining what it is that you know or what it is that you would like to share, or if you say something, here's my 2 cents, right? Incredibly culturally important phrase, right? Because we're talking about cents, which refers to the US currency, right? And in this case, you're kind of trying to say that I have a little bit of information that my opinion is just, here for you to look at. Right, to add to that is also one of the phrases that you can use or your students can use in their repertoire of expressing their opinion. Okay. Now let's take a look at eliciting opinions or asking others to share their opinions. So what do you think about something is one of the most typical ways, right? But what if you say, why do you believe that, right? Is also a question essentially that elicits or asks others to explain their opinion. Have you considered, and the topic of your discussion can follow, what about this specific idea, right? So when you promote these different ways of creating, of asking someone to share their opinion, you're expanding your students' authentic language use repertoire. Okay. Okay, now, so to practice sharing opinions or just sharing for beginners, right? We have a never have I ever activity that I personally used with lower levels in the program. The purpose of this activity is to facilitate student engagement and promote speaking, right? Now, the target language here could be practice patterns such as the present perfect tense. Opinion sharing and eliciting opinions can be added to a more complex version of this game for advanced students. And time and frequency for this could be anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes. Okay. All right. So the instructions are pretty simple. So basically your students have to raise their hand and extend all of their fingers. One of the students says something that they have never done, but they might believe, or they believe that others have done. The name of the game is Never Have I Ever, but you should probably start using I have never instead of the more complicated version. Students who have done the activity get a point by putting one of the fingers down, right? So if they have done it, they put it down. Those who haven't done the activity keep the same number of fingers up. This process is repeated with other students making sentences in turns and in small groups. When students put all of their fingers down, they are out. They can still contribute, right? They can still make sentences. The first one to be out is the winner. Okay. All right, so let's demonstrate. Kara, are you ready to have I never have I ever?
I am ready. I've got my 5 fingers.
Okay, very nice. Okay, please raise your hand, right, and have all the 5 fingers extended. If you have done the activity, right, you can fold one of your fingers. Okay, ready? Let's do this. I have never had hot chocolate. Oh.
I have had hot chocolate.
Great. I have never been to Colorado. Ooh.
I've been to Colorado.
Great. I have never had a nightmare.
I wish, but I have had a nightmare.
Exactly. And I have never gotten a bad grade.
I'm sure I've gotten one in my lifetime,
Okay.
so I will put a finger down there.
That's fantastic. Okay, so how many fingers do you have?
I have
Just
one
one.
finger
Oh
left.
my gosh. Well, then you win. Very nice. Okay, let's try. Now it's our participants' turn to play with us. It's game time. Okay, so dear participants, please have your hands up, right, or one hand up with all 5 fingers extended. Once you fold one of them, once you fold all of them, I'm so sorry, send a smiley face into the chat, and those who do it faster win. Okay, so ready, steady, go. Okay. I have never traveled to Brazil. I have never slept on a plane. I have never tried a raw egg. I have never read Harry Potter. Just watched it. I have never failed a test. I have never participated in a marathon. It was a half marathon, so half truth. Okay, and the last one, I have never seen a celebrity in real life. Oh my goodness, we have so many winners. Very nice.
Yes, so many of our participants have had these experiences. Thank you so much for sending your smiley face and winning the game.
That's wonderful. Okay. All right, let's move on to the reflection and a write down time. So how would you use this or a similar game with your students? Think of maybe eliciting speaking and discourse, right? Opinion sharing.
Wonderful. So now that we've all had the chance to practice this game, how would you use this or a similar game with your students? Let us know in the chat what topics you might use this for, or how you might use this in your classroom. Wonderful. Sabina is saying that's a great way to get to know students' opinions. Absolutely. Wonderful. Joelma is saying they would flip it around and would use "have you ever" as questions, being able to practice that. Wonderful. Irina is telling us about when in the class they would use it, which is as a warm-up, something to get the lesson started. Wonderful.
Great idea.
Pierre is saying they can use it about music, about songs folks have heard or musicians. Wonderful.
That's a fantastic idea.
That's great. We have multiple teachers. I'm seeing Mai and Zanalova saying the present perfect tense and practicing that grammatical structure. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. And the last one I'll take here, Prapasa is saying Jeopardy, using it in those types of questions, different categories, almost like a brick-air game there.
Very nice. All fantastic ideas. I love the warm-up idea and the fact that the present perfect is so difficult. We do have to squeeze in some fun practicing it. Very nice. Thank you so much for your input, right, and feedback. Okay, so the next couple of strategies that we're going to focus on are probably, in my opinion, right, are some of the most essential in helping our students to learn and acquire the new language. They're probably one of the most controversial, difficult, and challenging to acquire, however. So the two strategies I'm going to talk about are called repairing a conversation, or sometimes we're referring to this strategy as asking for clarification, and interrupting, right? Okay, so when do students use these strategies, or should use these strategies? If they do not understand, if they didn't hear what was said, if they misunderstood a portion of what was said, or they need a challenge, an opinion they disagree with, or maybe a detail they disagree with, right? So these are the reasons why we have these strategies. Okay, let's do the next slide. It's your turn to tell us your experience with these two strategies, asking for clarification and interrupting. What are some challenges, do you think, for EFL students to be able to use these strategies?
That's a great question, Jane, and I think will probably get us to some of those contextual and cultural components. And with our global audience, I'm expecting we'll see a lot of challenges for EFL students associated with asking for clarification or interrupting. What are some of those challenges that you see with your students when they are trying to ask for clarification or interrupt a conversation? I'm seeing Irina right away saying they switch to their native language or switch out of the target language to do that. Seeing Pierre echo that, saying in his location, they combine English and French, so they mix their target and
nice.
language. Absolutely. Great. We have some participants that are adding what phrases they would have their students use. So repeat please, or something short that students can use. Wonderful. Natalie is saying students might have difficulties in understanding the question itself, so might not even know how to ask for clarification because they may not understand that it was a question or what is summarized. Absolutely. Mariana is saying It's intimidating for them to ask sometimes. And it also depends on the age and the confidence of the student. Absolutely, that definitely resonates with my time in the EFL classroom, is building that safety and confidence to make students feel comfortable. Saibun is adding that fear of being right or wrong, even in asking for that clarification. And Priyanka is echoing shyness. Definitely. Lots of great responses, everyone. Thank you.
Fantastic responses, and that's actually a nice segue into what I'm about to talk about next, right? So let's move on to the repairing a conversation strategy. Indeed, it's one of the most challenging because it shows weakness, right? Vulnerability, something that your students might not really want to show in front of others. If they're asking to clarify, others might think that they didn't know the word, that they weren't prepared. All those thoughts fly through their head before they're even able to come up with a proper strategy, right? Proper sentence starter to be able to ask to clarify something. But it's truly one of the most important things, because remember, language acquisition only happens when there is enough comprehensible input, right? Enough understandable information around your students to be able to really get the meaning, right? And figure out that meaning. And oftentimes what happens is we revert to that native language strategy, which sometimes can be considered rude or even inappropriate in the target language. So let's take a look at some sentence starters, some nice phrases that you can add to your students' repertoire if they would like to clarify something. So could you explain or clarify is a very typical strategy, but saying something like, oh, what was that? Right? Or come again. Very informal, but very typical in authentic interaction when you didn't catch something, but you didn't hear something, and you would like to clarify that. More sophisticated strategies, of course, are listed on the reference Discourse Strategy document. So please do refer to that one. Okay. Now, when it comes to polite interruption, a lot of my students say, Jane, this is not okay. I can't interrupt. I cannot. It's simply impolite. Well, it's true and not exactly true. Interruption sometimes is necessary. When you have a limited amount of time to show that you understand, to show your professors that you have an opinion, to show your colleagues that you have a valuable input, valuable opinion to share, you must use this strategy, but you must use it in a culturally appropriate way. So again, introducing these different conversation starters is going to be essential, right? So some of my students are big fans of, sorry to jump in here, but I wanted to clarify something. Before we go on, I wanted to mention something else, right? Pardon? Just raising the tone a little bit and then jumping it with an opinion, right? And again, there are many other varieties of polite interruption, from just making eye contact to raising your hand, from saying, sorry, but could I also add something, is going to be one of them. But it's essential to introduce this to your students' repertoire so they do not revert to very familiar strategies. And believe me, these are not going to be automated. At some point, they have to be memorized first to be able to become natural next. All right. Moving on to the activity. So how to practice interruption, polite interruption, right? And how to practice clarification, such great strategies, right? So I've done many different varieties of this game, but it's usually referred to as Tragic Quest activity. The purpose of this activity in your classroom is to facilitate students to use the target language, and in this course, and in this case, it's the discourse strategy of asking for clarification and interruption. So the time of this game, it's essentially up to you. So the team who finds their item faster wins. So let's take a look at some rules here. Okay, so what you do is you hide a treasure, right? It could be any item from your classroom. It could be maybe a dry eraser, or it could be something else that you would like your students to actually keep, right? You give your students a map with missing information or advanced vocabulary in the directions, right? You know that they're going to be forced to clarify that information to be able to find the item, right? So an example would be follow the path and turn at the corner, right? So there's the essential information is omitted, so they will be forced to clarify. And when they do that, make sure they use the sentence starters, those discourse strategies to clarify in an authentic way. And when responding to students, that's key as well. When responding to students' questions, provide too much information to force them to politely interrupt you because the time for the activity might be set as a limited time, okay? Very nice. All right, some adaptation ideas here. You can, of course, have multiple teams, multiple items, different maps, and of course, you can use written prompts or modulate the content based on your student levels. Okay. All right, jumping on to the next strategy, which is agreement and disagreement. And again, so important, right? To be able to disagree with someone in a polite manner and agree with someone. So when do we want our students to be using these strategies? Is when they agree 100%, when they agree partially, and when they disagree 100%, right? Remember that speaking to someone who agrees or disagrees with everything sometimes feels pointless, right? So we've got to make sure that some of these strategies are used effectively, all right? Let's take a look at some of the starters here. So again, how do we agree? I agree. Number 2 is probably the most common phrase to use, but you can simplify it even further. You can say, oh, I see. Right? And this is also a very authentic way of confirming that you are on the same page with someone. By the way, a strategy as well. When you say we're on the same page, it means you agree with the person, right? Now, my personal favorite here is a more spoken version when you say, I subscribe to everything you just said, right? It's more of a formal/informal, depends on the situation. And of course, more formal version, I concur with your assessment of the situation, is way more formal. Okay, now how do we disagree? Such a difficult strategy to use correctly and contextually appropriately, right? And a lot of times what the difficulty is actually is, again, we're reverting to our first culture. And in our culture, at least in my culture, it's okay to say, no, you're wrong. I disagree. That's not correct. And in the English context, that would be perceived as rude in a lot of instances, right? So how do we teach our students to politely disagree? Well, maybe we will expand their repertoire with some of these starters. We can say, oh, I'm sorry, what about? And again, consider that other opinion. I don't think I can agree with this, or I have to disagree with this, as if something makes you do that instead of you doing it, right? I can see how you would think that, but, and then expressing your point of view is going to be a great way to be polite and yet express your opinion and disagreement, which is also important sometimes. Okay, very nice. Now, after disagreeing, it's customary to build consensus. Of course, yes, we have differences in opinions, but it's also important to remind our students that one of the most authentic ways of communicating is being on the same page, right? Is building consensus, is showing to our students, is showing to our audience that we might disagree, but we're still kind of, right, we're mostly agreeing. And phrases like, can we all agree that something is so and so? It seems that we're all for something, right? It seems that we can all agree that can be great ways of building consensus after a heated debate or a discussion. Okay. All right, reflection time. Tell me, please, is disagreeing in English similar to how you disagree in your language or culture?
This is such a great question, Jane. I'm so excited to see what our audience says. So let us know in the chat, is disagreeing in English similar to how you disagree in your language and culture? I think this is such a tricky thing to figure out when you are navigating a new language or culture, because you really need both of those pieces, the vocabulary in the language you're trying to speak, but also the cultural awareness of how to use that language appropriately. So very excited to see you. Susu is saying body language can be a really helpful way to either enhance your disagreement or minimize it so it feels less rude. That's a great idea. Thank you for sharing. Wonderful. Andrea is saying it is similar in English to how it is in their language, Spanish, but for their culture particularly, it's okay to express your opinion whether you agree or not. So it is appropriate to come out and say that. Zuelma is saying it is a little similar, but in their culture, it's not common to disagree with adults.
Very interesting.
That you're not used to, right? So adults or strangers. Pierre is saying in their culture, being more polite and proposing an alternative rather than outright disagreeing with somebody's idea. Absolutely. Great. Fernando is echoing being aware of nonverbal forms of agreeing and disagreeing. And when working online or with students virtually, using emojis can be a way to kind of lightly disagree or agree. Wonderful. Lena is saying, I don't think so. In my culture, it's very difficult to disagree with someone. That's the other side of even more difficult.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last comment I'll read out for this is Hamza saying, in English, it's so gentle. And in
that's such a great word. Such wonderful, thank you so much for such wonderful feedback. Indeed, it's a great word, I think, Kara, yes. Gentle, a subtle way of disagreeing, where we're not saying words no. If you have noticed, none of the strategies really listed the word no at all, right? And in a lot of cultures, I see comments that are saying that using these strategies is helping students even transfer that skill onto their native language, and they're sounding more polite in their native language when they disagree. It's not to say that, disagreement in your culture and your native language is impolite, but it's just perceived differently, right? We all read everything, perceive everything through our cultural lens. All right, thank you very much. Okay. All right, so how can we practice this very essential, very important strategy? So we can use agreement and disagreement activity that I have here is one of many different ways of practicing this, right? But the purpose is always to facilitate your students' conversation skills and increase their confidence in agreeing and disagreeing, right? And of course, the target language would be polite and culturally appropriate agreement and disagreement strategies we've looked at. It's a timed game. It could be 20 to 25 minutes, but again, it's up to you to adapt however it is most useful and beneficial for your students. Okay. All right. So what I normally do is we use cards, we use different notations, right, that are incomplete, right? So for example, I am going to blank this weekend. Students will have to pick their cards in turn and finish the statements with something that others will have to disagree or agree with. For example, if someone says, I'm going to fly to the moon this weekend, yeah, you would probably force your peers to disagree. And those whose statements were disagreed with most win. Yeah, that's how it works. If you disagree with me the most, basically I win. You can turn it around, of course, and make the agreement be the winner. Okay. Very nice. All right, so let's do some quick recap, and please again note, refer to the Discourse Strategies document for more examples of other more sophisticated, as I say, more fancy, right, discourse strategies for your classroom. So, but today we've talked about the three core areas of discourse, and the strategies are related to expressing opinions, and eliciting opinions. We looked at repairing a conversation or asking for clarification. We looked at interrupting, which has to be done in a polite way, much like disagreeing, well, and agreeing as well, right? Building consensus is what we also have to remember after the disagreement strategy is implemented. Okay. All right. Can you share what strategies do your students use often, and which ones you could facilitate more, in your opinion?
Wonderful, Jane. So as a quick kind of reflection moment here of the 3 strategies listed there that Jane has been talking about, which do you use most often, and which could you facilitate more in your classroom?
I would imagine sharing opinions, right, Kara? I think that's probably.
And probably interrupting a conversation, given said that was the challenge. Definitely.
Yes.
So I think we can probably, we're seeing a lot of folks saying that a little bit of all of them is probably what they need to do. Both they do some and they need to facilitate more. Wonderful.
Fantastic. Okay, very nice. Well, now that we've practiced and looked at some of the strategies, let's bring it all together. And a lot of you have mentioned debates. One of the most favorite things of mine to do with my students is to have classroom debates. So the purpose of this would be to practice multiple things, including doing research, differentiating opinions from facts, using appropriate discourse strategies to prove your point, right? So that's very complex activity. And for target language, we of course are going to focus on all of the aforementioned strategies we just looked at. The preparation for this task or activity can be quite time consuming, right? So 1 to 2 weeks on average, and in class, it usually takes about 35 to 45 minutes. So bear that in mind, okay? And so how to organize a debate, many of you have probably done it and have maybe your own versions, but what we normally do is first we come up with a topic or thesis, right, that is debatable, and that's not always easy to find, right? Something that is debatable, not yes or no, but there is a lot more gray in between. For example, smart technology makes us dumb. Quite a controversial statement, right? So then you divide your class into 2 groups. You may run a quick survey and see who supports this motion and who is against this motion. Assign research tasks to each participant. That would be the most important key rule here, is to make sure that everyone participates, and of course establish guidelines such as use reliable sources, incorporate discourse strategies, and so on. Go over debate examples, and a great resource for you if you haven't yet used Intelligence Squared Debates is one of my favorite places to draw inspiration and get some topics, right? Practice debate portions in class and have the debate, okay? All right, now speaking of assessing all of this, right? Debates can be very challenging to assess because, again, there's so many different things that we're trying to incorporate or use in this activity. So first, what I normally do is I establish the criteria or the things that I'm going to specifically focus on. So, for example, if agreement and disagreement is the strategy that I would like to focus on, I'm going to put it in my criteria. And I'm going to have a rating from excellent to need work, right? And of course, the total points is going to show your student where they stand with regard to this strategy. Now, for more details, please refer to the rubric exemplar that has been provided in the pre-webinar materials, okay? Moving on to simplification, right? Also, remember that doesn't have to be that, the assessment doesn't have to be that complicated. It always can be just a checklist. Focus on the same things. Let's say if they use at least 2 agreement-disagreement strategies that you have practiced, check mark, right? If they express an opinion and supported it with evidence, check mark. And, they use key vocabulary and key grammar, check mark as well. Okay, So how would you assess your students' debates or similar activities where there is a lot to look at?
Wonderful. Let us know, everyone. How would you assess your students' debates? With all of the things that debates are helping your students practice, how would you assess them? Wonderful. We have a lot of comments coming in just saying how useful this session has been, how excited folks are to try these strategies out in their classrooms. Johnny is saying a rubric to assess students' performance in debate, very useful. So figuring out what those components of the rubric are, just as you mentioned, Jane, lots of echo of that strategy. Absolutely. I'll take one or two more here. Aiton is saying using an analytic rubric. And a lot of people, Jane, are saying they will use this rubric idea or modify the rubric that's shared.
Absolutely.
And build off of that context. Joelma is also adding by checking language use, vocabulary, and pronunciation. So looking for some other language skills as a way to assess. Wonderful, everyone. Thanks for sharing those comments. Great
ideas, definitely. Okay, very nice. So let's recap. In this session, we covered reasons for more target language use. Remember, it's the exposure, the amount of exposure, and of course, the comprehensible input. Don't forget about it, right? Ways to incorporate the target language in your classroom, meaning from beginners to getting gradually more complicated with output and input. We talked about authentic target language use, specifically focusing on discourse strategies. And we looked at some fun activities. Of course, there's a variety of them and variety of adaptations for beginners and more advanced students that you can do. And well, folks, thank you so very much, everyone, for your wonderful comments and for joining us today. We hope that this webinar was helpful and give you some ideas as to how to integrate more target and authentic discourse in your language classroom. Before I turn this over to Kara, I wanted to encourage you to analyze your lesson routines. Find 2 or 3 ways to incorporate authentic English discourse and encourage your students to experiment and explore the language. Provide guidance and feedback along the way. These are some quick references here, but don't forget that there are more materials available to you in the pre-webinar folder.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jane, for sharing all of those engaging ideas for effectively incorporating authentic target language